Hi, folks. Ziggy is standing at the screen door and refusing to come out. I don't get it. It's a nice sunny day. It's warm out. He just doesn't want to come out. Go figure. So today I want to talk about free will, and this is one of these sort of philosophical problems that for a long time I just didn't care about. You know, this free will versus determinism is something everybody talks about, but I'm not so interested in it. But lately I've become interested in it because I was reading the story of Leonard Cohen and his interaction with Zen, his involvement with Zen. As some of you know, singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen of I'm Your Man fame. He and Suzanne and what else did he do? He did a lot of good songs. Chelsea Hotel. Anyway, he was involved in Zen Buddhism for a long time. He's one of the few sort of famous Zen Buddhists. But according to his biographer, Sylvia Simmons, I think, anyway, he had suffered from deep depression. And actually he says this too in some interviews. And all during his time with Zen was suffering from this, and it became really a problem, and he quit Zen, or I don't know if he quit Zen really, but he left the monastery where he was, leaving behind a poem to his teacher that said something like, I'm leaving you, Roshi, I've met a woman. He didn't actually meet a woman that he was leaving the Roshi for. He was leaving him for a man, Ramesh Balsekar, who was a teacher of Advaita Vedanta. And I started looking at some of Ramesh Balsekar's books, and there's a ton of videos of him on YouTube, and they're interesting. I haven't seen anything I don't like by him. But he takes a quite different approach from the Zen approach. So that's my jumping off point for this video. So what I want to start with is I found some material on my teacher Gudo Nishijima Roshi's blog. They're all still online and you can find them, and some of them are kind of interesting. There's a lot of these exchanges with different students who would write to him. And here's one about free will. As human beings, do we possess free will? And he says, thank you very much for your question, and I clearly say yes with an exclamation point. Because when we want to eat a meal, usually we can eat it. And when we want to stop eating it, we can do it. Nice example. Next question. Do all events/actions have a cause that is outside of that event/action? And Nishijima Roshi says, I think that our action is always done by our own action. This is English. So I think that it is rather difficult for me to think that our action occurs from cause. Another question. One question in relation to free will that springs to mind is free from what? And Nishijima Roshi answers, I think that free will does not want to flee from anything, and so it is called free will. It's kind of interesting. He does that thing that a lot of Japanese people do when they don't distinguish between L's and R's, and I think he's trying to do it as a little bit of a literary device, but flee and free to us English speakers sound like very distinct words, but to a Japanese speaker they sound like the same word. They sound like those words that are pronounced the same but have different meanings. God, I can't think of any right off the top of my head, but you know what I mean. It sounds like one of those words to a Japanese speaker, but it doesn't to us English speakers. And someone says, maybe it's a question of how we perceive reality. And Nishijima Roshi says, yes, it is true, so we practice Zazen every day. And the questioner says, in Zazen it seems at times that we can be free of will, and that this represents a special sort of free action beyond the discriminations of self or other. And Nishijima Roshi says, I agree with your idea. So that's an interesting take on the matter of free will. So he's saying free will, but with maybe some caveats. Now this quote is from Jiddu Krishnamurti, and I feel like I gave this quote on another one of these videos, but I'm not going to go back through and try to figure out which one it was, so forgive me if I already gave this quote. Your life is shaped, controlled by the society which you have created. You have created the wars, the leaders, you have created the organized religions of which you are now slaves. So your life is predetermined, and to be free you must first be aware that your life is predetermined, that it is conditioned, that all your responses are more or less the same as those of everybody else throughout the world. Superficially, your responses may be different. You may respond one way here, another way in India or China, and so on, but fundamentally you are held in the framework of your particular conditioning, and you are never an individual. Therefore, it is absurd to talk about freedom and self-determination. You can choose between blue cloth and red cloth, and that's about all. Your freedom is on that level. If you go into it very deeply, you will find that you are not an individual at all. But in going into it very deeply, you will find that you can be free from all this conditioning. As a German, as a Catholic, as a Hindu, as a believer or a non-believer, you can be free from it all. Then you will know what it is to have an innocent mind, and it is only such a mind that can find out what is truth. I feel like for sure I gave that quote on another video. I'm sorry if I did. Now, here is Ramesh Balsekar on free will from his book Final Truth, A Guide to Ultimate Understanding. Pretty grandiose title there. The essence of the ultimate understanding is the ineluctable fact that the individual human being as such does not, cannot, have any volition. He is without any independence of choice, of decision, and action, for the simple reason that the human being is not an autonomous entity. The human being is merely an infinitesimal part of the totality of manifestation. That the human being can see, hear, etc. through his senses is merely because he has, like any other sentient being, insect or animal, been endowed with sentience. That he can think is merely because he has, in addition, been endowed with intellect. In the absence of consciousness, there is no sentience, no intellect, and as far as the human being is concerned, no manifest world. So that's the teaching that we can presume Leonard Cohen heard, and this aspect of the free will argument seems to have been very instrumental in getting Leonard Cohen out of his deep, deep depression. And I find it was good for me, too. When I came across that sort of explanation of it, I was like, oh, yeah. And it was a great relief because, you know, there's only so much you can do. And speaking of that, I'd like to give you, to round out the quotations part of this video, a quotation from Dogen. Dogen says, Great Master Yakusan Kodo, the story goes, at the suggestion of Great Master Musai, visits Zen Master Kozei Daijaku. And I think Kozei Daijaku is the same as Baso, aka Matsu, depending on which, it's the Japanese translate, or Japanese pronunciation and Chinese pronunciation anyway, in case you care about such things. He asks, I have more or less clarified the import of the 3 vehicles and the 12 divisions of the teaching. That means he's got pretty much the intellectual ideas about Zen as an intellectual sort of construct, that philosophical construct. But just what is the ancestral master's intention in coming from the West? That is a common Zen question, and the ancestral master is Bodhidharma, and he came from India into China, and he's credited with bringing Zen Buddhism into China, which became a huge deal. You know, it's one of the few times where a mystical branch of a religious tradition became the mainstream branch of that tradition. In other religions, it hardly ever happens, but in Chinese Buddhism, for a time, Zen was the thing. And the deal with Bodhidharma is he came from India to China, and he sat in a cave for 9 years and refused to teach anybody. People would come in and we wouldn't teach them. And eventually 4 people, one by one, convinced him to let them stay with him. It was 3 men and 1 woman, and they each in their own way convinced him, and one of them had lost an arm. Some bandits had attacked him on the way up to visit Bodhidharma, and he'd still kept on going up to see Bodhidharma. He was that determined, and that was enough to impress him. So it took a lot to impress Bodhidharma. But he only had these 4 students. So at the time that Bodhidharma was alive, for all he knew, he was teaching 4 people. And a lot of people would complain. I get this question from time to time about my own stuff when I do a speaking engagement, and they'll say, well, we can only guarantee 150 people. Are you willing to do it? And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And usually, you know, it sometimes matters about the expense of travel and blah, 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 which is probably not what Bodhidharma was worried about. But generally, I'll say yes. And I've done talks to 4 or 5 people from time to time. There was one time in Poland, 3 people showed up for the talk. So I'll do it. But it must have seemed kind of frustrating. Well, I'm not going to say, I don't think Bodhidharma himself was frustrated, but a kind of person who had this idea that he was going to start a great movement would have been really frustrated by the fact that he only in his lifetime ever taught 4 people. And that does not seem to be the case with Bodhidharma. So what was his intention? Was his intention to create the big movement that was Zen Buddhism in China? Maybe, maybe not. But that's the end. The question is based on that he did something that had consequences. Is consequences the right word? Effects, beyond anything he could have intended. Same with Dogen. He had a very small number of students. Thus questioned, Zen Master Daijaku says, "Sometimes I make him lift an eyebrow or wink an eye, and sometimes I do not make him lift an eyebrow or wink an eye. Sometimes to make him lift an eyebrow or wink an eye is right, and sometimes to make him lift an eyebrow or wink an eye is not right." Hearing this, Master Yakusan realizes a great realization and says to Daijaku, in Sekito's order, that's where he was before, "I have been like a mosquito that climbed onto an iron ox." Now, there are some wild interpretations of this little story out there, and I was looking at some the other day, and I just thought they were just plain wrong. And some of them were by teachers who I otherwise really respect, so I'm not going to try to trash these guys. But I think what he's saying is obvious. When he says, "I make him wink an eye or lift an eyebrow," the him he's talking about is himself. There's these other versions that go on. He's talking about Shakyamuni Buddha and blah blah blah, and only, but he's talking about himself, and he's talking about the fact that as far as freedom of choice goes, we are very limited. We have a set of circumstances we are put into. For example, it's not that every word that's coming out of my mouth on this video right now is predetermined from time immemorial, but there's only a certain set of things I would even think of to say, and they all have to do with my circumstances and my life before this and whatever previous incarnations I might have come into it. The fact that I'm able to talk to you folks and that there's an audience willing to listen to me on video talking about these things, all of it comes into play and limits what I can say to a very small extent. Not to a small extent, to a great extent it limits it, but into a very small, narrow sort of passage of things I can say and things I can do. So our choice is limited. Nishijima Roshi gives the example of you can start eating and stop eating, and Master Daijaku or Basu or whoever, Baso or Matsu, says lift an eyebrow or wink an eye. So, that's the example of the small thing. But the way it works into Buddhist ethics is because we give the example of Bodhidharma, who did this small thing that had great effects. The small things we do can have tremendous effects. So that's why we have to be ethical, and that's why we have to be careful with what we do. So that is free will. In I don't know how many minutes, because I stopped and started the video a bunch of times and I can't tell how long it was. But I hope it wasn't too long, and I hope it wasn't too boring. If you want to contribute to me making more long and boring videos like this one, you can send money to the URL you are seeing below on the screen. That will give you links to my Patreon and PayPal accounts. That is my only way of making a living right now, and I really appreciate those of you who are able to donate. If you can't donate because you don't have a lot of money and whatever, and you're having trouble, don't donate to me, because I'm not desperate. But the reason I'm not desperate is because folks like you keep donating. So have a good time all the time. See you later. Bye.